Yes,
Sorry,
okay.
People are hanging on.
Yeah, let's make a start then, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's make.
Let me. Okay.
There you go. So I would say hello to everyone who's watching online. It's really good to have you. I think tonight we actually have more people watching online than we do actually here in the room, but that's fine. That's part of the benefit of doing it this way. As we were just saying as we were having this conversation, the fact that we can stream these, the fact that they can be recorded, it kind of feels that it has more worth to it, because there'll be ideas there. You never know who's going to stumble over them in years to come and find them really helpful. So before we start, let's just pray. And Father, just as we come to your word, it's one of those things that, you say of yourself that you're the bread from heaven and you're the water of life, and out of our innermost being come streams of living water, and those things that sustain us, Lord Jesus, and Scripture is one of those things. And Father, just in the struggles, ups and downs of the day, where we can get low, we can get high, I find it so nourishing to be able to come to verses that I've read 100 times and still find something fresh in them, and still find things that are new in them, Lord Jesus. And so we just really pray that what we record tonight will continue to be part of that process of keep finding stuff there that tells us we've really encountered the source of life in you and in your word and in your story. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. So we are gradually getting there, and I kind of feel as we've been putting these slides together. I've been putting the slides together for these evening talks. It was this kind of first cut at saying, well, let's take the Sermon on the Mount. Let's look at it from a psychological perspective, which doesn't mean ignoring some of the background and the kind of cross references in the Bible and so on. But let's do it with that way. And it was this kind of first rush through, and I've been surprised at how much I put in, but at the same time surprised at how much I've not had time to put in. So it kind of feels like it's only a first step in something that probably has more depth to it than I realised when I said, well, let's have a go at doing this. And because each time I've done it, I've kind of sat down, like this evening. I'm very conscious of stuff that we could have stuck in tonight, but just wasn't the time. I spent the day putting these slides together. You may not think that when you see them, but they did. So yeah, it just feels in many ways we're scratching on something, but it shouldn't surprise us. Sorry, it feels a bit like I'm rambling in kind of the preamble, but the way I'm always astounded by the way in which Scripture is able to speak to people who mentally think so differently, whose cultural experience is so different, whose way of seeing the world and of ordering things and understanding of science versus the supernatural and all of those things that take changes over millennia and over continents and in different locations, at so many different perspectives and views, and yet these words somehow capture people and these stories somehow create a commonality, a common experience that has real life to it. So anyway, that's just me rambling about why I like I like having the privilege of being able to plan these things. So we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. We're looking at week 6, the meek who inherit the earth. And it's one of those kind of interesting little things. I did a thing a couple of years ago with a guy I kind of crossed paths with some of the work I do in London chaplaincy wise. So I've got a little kind of home group style thing. We meet in someone's restaurant, someone who owned a little restaurant. It was a Greek restaurant. So I went, and most of the people there had Greek origins, Greek connections. And I did a kind of a Jesus in the Old Testament presentation. They were all really enthusiastic and very encouraging to me. And then one of the things they were kind of pointing out, which they like to do, is that in Greek the word meek doesn't mean the same as in English, you see, because it's one of the things they often like to bring in. And I've kind of put this, there is a kind of a real sense as we think about the meek who are going to inherit the earth, that our English definition of the word has lost something. And it's quite interesting. I had a quick look, as I always do before I'm putting these things together, at what Wikipedia had to say about the meek inheriting the earth. And it starts off by saying a very similar thing. I haven't quoted it exactly, I've just kind of summarised what it has in its first paragraph, that meekness has lost its original kind of meaning in modern English. Because we tend to think of it now as humble or submissive. And if you go and look in an online dictionary or in a dictionary, you'll find words like submission or humble or kind of gentle and so on. But actually it's the definition actually is much more to do, I put it in quotes, it's restraining one's power so as to allow room for others, which is what these Greek guys were telling me at this. See, that's what it means. It doesn't mean being totally kind of weak and trodden on. It's that actually you have something, but you don't need to go. You don't need to go and make people feel small about that. You don't need to impose it on people. You don't need to shove it on them and so on. And so as a result, they actually kind of highlight that Aquinas, understanding that, equated it to the classical virtue, i.e. that comes through the Greek philosophers and through the Romans, of magnanimity, that actually people who are who are generous of spirit. So that actually, if you like, meekness has actually got something of generosity of spirit, which has a very different nuance to it. But generosity of spirit means I can see you're getting this wrong, but I'm not going to make a big deal of it. I could exact my rights here, but I'm not going to. And there's something of that in generosity of spirit, but also there, as we know, if we use that kind of phrase, generosity of spirit, that there is a grace to it. People who are big in spirit. And so as we're thinking about meekness, it's important we kind of put that into perspective. We're not talking about sort of hand-wringing humility. It's actually about knowing who we are, having confidence in who we are. But that, as a sober reflection, we also know what we're not. And because we know what we're not, we're kind of much more open and generous with other people who aren't what they should be, because we're aware of that in themselves. But we can also see the values in them and the strengths in them and so on. So there's something much broader, I think much more kind of enthusing once we kind of get our head around really what meekness means. And you kind of think of it from a biblical context before we get into the psychological, because you actually find the idea of inheriting the earth comes from the Old Testament, and there's something of a kind of something that's probably Jesus is drawing at. So I've got the quote here from Psalms 37. There's 2 verses. Those who wait for Yahweh will inherit the earth. So there's the inherit the earth bit. And there are people who are waiting on Yahweh. So there is a kind of sense of submission, but it's not a weak submission, but they're waiting on the Lord. In a little while the wicked won't be anymore. Okay, so they've disappeared, but the meek will inherit the earth. So you see there's a connection here between that sort of dependency on Yahweh and the fact that in that sense there's something meek in that. They're not trying to do it in their own strength. It's not that I'm so good I can do it. I'm waiting on the Lord. The wicked might do it a different way, but it's those that wait on the Lord who inherit the earth, and it's the meek who inherit the earth. And delight in abundant peace. And I like that little phrase. You'll see it kind of often goes with meekness. Well, I say it often goes. I've got 2 quotes from the Old Testament. You see it in both of them. And I put there in square brackets as well-being, abundant peace. Because actually, as we're going to see, one of the things, if you like, the counter side, the flip side of meekness actually does bring stress. And as we're going to see as Jesus expounds in this passage, he is going to talk about anxiety. Don't be anxious, don't be anxious. And because actually in many ways what he's addressing here is some attitude of spirit that actually puts us into a kind of a satisfied place, into that shalom place, that well-being place. So so the meek will inherit the earth and delight in abundant peace, or they're going to delight in well-being. Psalm 25, who is the man who fears Yahweh? There it is again, you see, submitted under the Lord. He will direct him in his choices. And that's an interesting phrase. We're going to come to making choices in a bit. His soul shall rest in goodness, and his offspring will inherit the earth. And so again, you've got the same promise, the inheriting of the earth. This time it's belonging to his children, but there's something about creating this kind of a culture that there's a fear of the Lord here. There was waiting on the Lord before. There's a kind of, in that sense, that sort of that humble, meek submission to, it's not that therefore I'm rubbish, it's just that actually I'm totally dependent. I know my need. Not because of poverty, we'll think about that next week, not because I'm so poor in spirit, but even when I'm strong in spirit, I still need him. I still need the Lord. So I put notice in the connection again. See, this time it's resting in goodness. His soul shall rest in good. It actually just says good in Hebrew, but the Hebrew we stretch it with goodness. It's the quality of good. His soul is in that good place, and his offspring will inherit the land. So what we're going to see as we go through, because Jesus starts to unpack it, is the contrast really between meekness is that meekness is there, and it's what displaces envy. And I think I've got it on another slide, but I think the order in this is not perfect tonight because I was rushing them through as I did. But do you remember how right at the beginning we kind of highlighted there's a connection between the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, and in one sense, not in one sense, in a real sense, what this whole section where Jesus is addressing meekness is unpacking the don't covet right at the end of the Ten Commandments. Don't covet your neighbour's wife, his household and servants, his donkeys, his lands, all of those things about his life. Don't covet those things. And that coveting kind of becomes, it's an old-fashioned word, but it is actually, of course, tied up with the concept of envy. And so, as we're going to see, there's a kind of a dynamic which is about kind of struggling in a comparative way with people for social status. And so there's a kind of, if you like, the flip side of the coin of meekness comes out as envy. And I got this nice little quote from the author, Joseph Epstein, who actually wrote a book called Envy. Says of all the seven deadly sins, only envy is no fun at all, which is kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, an interesting way of looking at it, because it is one of those things that actually right the way through ancient history people recognise it's a miserable thing to get caught in. Envy ruins your life as well as those around you, and it was an incredibly powerful thing. It was recognised in the ancient world, and actually it is one of the things that we have an antidote to spiritually in our faith, because we have a faith that actually prioritises things that we don't have to kind of compete with each other on. So in actual fact we have something that we can pursue and hunger and thirst for, which actually means that I don't have to measure myself by my status against the person next to me. And that can sound like a niceism, just everybody would say that about their faith or their religion, but it is true. I mean, it was kind of recognised just last year what was it, about 2 years ago now, I think, in a survey that was talking about the interactions. It was asking about how segmented our society was becoming, because it's getting more so. On the whole, people only meet with their peers now, and one of the few places they named just 2 places, and one was a million times better than the other. One of the few places you're likely to spend quality time and really actually get to know someone who doesn't come from the same ethnic background, social class, financial position as you, is in church. So people actually spend quality life and share quality life in church in a way that they don't anywhere else. The second place was in being a football supporter who goes to away matches and therefore sits on coaches with people who earn more than they do or less than they do, and gets on with them for those reasons. And so it was just saying we mustn't actually underestimate, therefore, if you like, the benefit to society that church brings, because it allows a level of kind of knowledge and understanding across those divides which nothing else is doing at the moment. Which is kind of a nice, it's just nice to notice that is a kind of genuine sort of secularly recognised kind of a dynamic of church. So Jesus is going to unpack meekness, and he's going to look at his rewards, but he does it as the antithesis of coveting. So it's kind of, as I say, it's his redefinition of "you shall not covet." So he took "you shall not commit adultery" and said, so actually it's the way you look at each other. Are you looking at each other just from the point of view of what are they worth to me, from a gratification point of view? You've heard it said, don't murder, but I say, don't call people idiots and run down their reputation. You've heard it said, pay your vows to the Lord, but I'm saying let your yes be yes. He takes the law as it's given by Moses, 10 Commandments plus the expositions, and he kind of redefines them and makes them more internal. And so here, in many ways, what Jesus is doing is kind of replacing the thing in us that requires us that to compete in terms of status and what I've got with the person next to me. With a kind of this place of meekness, which actually is just, I'm not really that bothered, it's not about status. I'm delighted with the skills I have, and I think, without wanting it to sound like therefore self-promoting or whatever, it's always one of those things, because you try, if you internalise the Sermon on the Mount, you try and apply it to yourself. And I try and ask myself the question, and then you realise that sometimes, only sometimes, but sometimes you actually match the thing you're asking of yourself, which is I know I've got certain skills, and it's a pleasure to be able to use them. It's rather than actually I need to do them, and I can be better than you. So much of what I do on a kind of pastoral sense with people in their workplace, you find that so much of their life is driven with sort of petty little into kind of office politics, which are really driven by these jealousies and envies, if I can put it that way. Whereas actually the challenge to us is not to say I'm rubbish, because that's not meekness. The challenge to us is to be able to enjoy what we've got and to be able to use it in that sense as a kind of a grace that we can gift to others and that we can serve the Lord with. So if we start the exposition side, so blessed are the meek, and Jesus starts it kind of expounding it. Last week we were looking at, he looked at righteousness, and he looked at the three classic ways in which Jews understood righteousness. But now he moves on, Matthew 6, so don't lay up treasures for yourself on the earth, where moth and rust consume. And straight away we're beginning to see, if you like, the seeds of anxiety that kind of flow out from these things, because we're storing up on earth things that in many ways are always running down, you know. And again, from that kind of pastoral point of view, it's and it probably is getting more so in a less and less stable world, but people who did all the right things, stocking away money for retirements and so on, and suddenly things have collapsed. Companies went bust and stole their pensions, and all of those things that actually suddenly, if that's where your security lies, it's suddenly become very insecure. So don't lay out treasures for yourself on earth, which doesn't mean to say, therefore, and I kind of put my hand up to this, because as a young person, I took a line, and I kind of, it's about trying to get the balance here, I feel like, which is, well, I'm going to live by faith, so therefore I don't need to think that hard about kind of financial issues, if that makes sense. I say, if that makes sense. It wouldn't make sense to anybody who lives around here, I'm sure. It made sense to me as a teenager living in London. So, for instance, we got our first flat, and you know, I didn't haggle too hard over the price. So I realised, looking back, we could have done, because, you know, that's fine. I don't want to worry about these things. And I didn't go and shop around for a good mortgage. We just got one which had a terrible rate on it, it turns out. But the whole kind of thing was, well, it's just, you know, that's not what our lives are about. Let's just do these things. And some years later, though, in a slightly different kind of circumstance, I felt very challenged by seeing in the parables that Jesus tells about faith, how he tells about the sower, the person who uses who invests and with his finances, and it grows, and therefore he has the benefits, and he's given more authority and so on. The very next one, and that seems to me all about the risk-taking faith, if you like. The very next parable is also about faith, but this time it's about prudent planning, if you like. So, and you know, it's the wise and foolish virgins, and so those that planned ahead were ready to be what it was, and I felt the Lord very much challenged me that there were opportunities I had missed in life in terms of service, because I hadn't actually acted by faith by planning for the future. That makes sense. And without wanting in any sense to be judgmental, having gone through this cycle myself up to a certain point, I realised actually, because I knew a lot of folks who lived by ministry, how common it was for people as they get older to have less in one sense to give. And we don't want to treat people in a utilitarian point of view, but as we were talking, John, as you get older you get tireder and so on. But actually they kind of almost became a blockage, because they didn't have the ability to kind of make space for others who were coming into that place, because they had never ever learned to kind of build for the future. And so as we approach this, it says don't lay up treasures for yourself. 100% that is exactly what we're looking at. But as with all of these things, Jesus is teaching within a context and a flow, and there are other places where he talks about the place to plan and to think ahead. Because what he's addressing here is actually not exactly not exactly how you should choose your mortgage, like I was doing it, or things like that. What he's really driving at, as we're going to see, is the attitude you bring to life, and actually how it creates stress around you, whether it actually allows you to do the things you're supposed to be able to do, or whether you don't do those things. So we've got to kind of put it in its context, which is where we are here. So don't lay up treasures for yourself on earth, where moth and rust consume, where the thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consume, where the thieves don't break through and steal. And then this is the phrase I always love, is, so for where your treasure is, there your heart will be as well. And that little phrase there really captures something. It's one of those kind of that you will often hear in a sort of slightly more Americanized and prosperity focused. I won't call it a prosperity gospel, because I don't think it belongs necessarily to the extreme. It's just, but you'll hear it more regularly in places that talk, where they'll say you need to sow where you want to grow, sow where you want to go. Now, sadly, of course, that kind of logic gets turned around and misused, because the person who's got a project he wants to fund tells everybody they've got to sow to their project, if you see what I mean. But actually, that principle is much more a personal one, which is if I'm wanting to go and participate, or if I want to be involved in something, I probably need to use some of my own resources to help get me there, if I can put it that way. And in that sense, what I'm doing is I'm putting my treasure into something, and the way Jesus puts it, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be as well. He almost he dangles something, if I can put it that way. If we stop in this, he doesn't say you'll put your treasure where your heart is. Because that doesn't tend to be the case. If we really want something, but we're not willing to spend money on it, we tend to take it by other ways, if I can put it that way. Or I'm not willing to invest in it. Let's use the word invest in a broader sense. I can want something and even get it that I'm not actually going to invest in myself. That's actually how I get it from other people. It's part of the coveting and dynamic, which is they've got it, I wish I had it, but I don't want to. But how come he's got it? Well, it's because he spent a large amount of money on it. Do I want to spend that money on it? No, I don't. I just want it. So I'll find a different way. You see, it kind of starts to drive at those things. But actually, there is a dynamic where we discover this is true. I can't remember exactly the order I've put all of these things as we run through this, but actually what we invest into is what we end up growing to appreciate. And interestingly, by appreciation, I don't just mean it tastes nicer in the moment. I mean it actually becomes kind of a part of our life that gives it real meaning and pleasure. And so, although I can sound like a long-playing record, because we all only have a handful of hobbies, you can't have thousands, otherwise they're not really hobbies. I get an inordinate amount of pleasure from my dogs now, and not because they're that special as dogs, although better not tell my wife that, but just simply because you spend a lot of time walking them and so actually because you invest into them, you find that you get something of a different quality back from them, which you wouldn't get if you borrowed somebody else's dog for the day. That there is something about that investment process that actually changes and impacts that sort of heart bit, which is again this well-being kind of dimension which you saw in those Old Testament verses. So lay out for treasures in heaven, for where your treasure is, your heart will be. Making choices that cost us actually change us. That's the statement I want to kind of hit. And actually it's something we can actually kind of test. This is a guy called Dan Gilbert. I've read a couple of his books, and there's a long video, a TED talk, and there's a TED talk and a longer video he's done. I put here on the psychology of envy, but actually he's talking about the process of what he calls synthetic happiness, which I can't remember if we've actually covered while I've done these sessions. If I've used that phrase, synthetic happiness, no. Okay, so the thing that's just making good choices is foundational to the generation of synthetic happiness. Synthetic happiness is happiness that somehow comes out of something of our aesthetic life. It's if you like, the happiness I get from the investment I've had in my dogs. Well, no, I'm being a little bit too precise there. If you win the lottery in 3 days' time or in a week's time, I always say if we win the lottery, it would be a miracle because we don't play it. So the Lord must really want us to win it if that happens to us. For all sorts of statistical reasons why we don't, but not for any judgmental reasons. But if you did, the evidence is, because it has been well and truly documented, is that the actual high will last for around 3 months, maybe up to 6 months. And in a year's time, you won't be any happier than when on the day before you won it. And very often, so you will definitely not be any happier. Very often you'll be a lot unhappier. And we understand the psychology of it, and this is one of the things he talks about. I'm giving background to the things that just touch on to the choice stuff. We're going to come in a minute, just because it's all part of the thing he delivers. You'll probably be unhappy, and we understand the reason. It's because the circuits in the brain, they refer to them as dopaminergic, which kind of respond to dopamine, which is kind of a pleasure satisfaction sort of hormone, and there are certain receptors in different parts of the brain, and as they respond to it, you kind of feel that feels good. People get dopamine hits from all sorts of things, from sugar, from sex, from winning a game, all sorts of things just hit that, and there's that kind of instant pleasure rush. And what's really interesting, this is a slight aside because it's not really part of tonight's, but it goes into this synthetic happiness side, is that, as I say, yes, that when you have a big natural hit, something good happens to you. Maybe you don't win the lottery, but you find a £20 note on the floor, and or something else, that kind of nature. You get this kind of little rush and a high, and but what happens is if tomorrow then you find £10, you will find it doesn't have as much of an effect. But it leaves a hunger in you to have the same thing happen to you. But when the same thing happens to you, it won't be as satisfying the next time. So it increases your hunger for something to happen, but it actually also reduces your ability to get satisfaction from it. Which is at the heart of almost all addictions. What's of course happening. Well, I say it is the heart of all addictions. Which is you get a certain high, which gives you a hunger, but actually the way that mentally the process works, you are now a little bit inured, you're a little bit anaesthetised to the effects that you get that way. So the next time is not quite so good. So in actual fact, the tragedy very often for people who have a one-off incredible experience is that nothing in life is ever as good again, if you like, and even if it was getting close, it wouldn't feel as good. And so as a result, a year after winning the lottery, people are actually, their levels of happiness are at best kind of what they were before, and very often they're in a worse place. The irony is that the opposite is true if you broke your back and were left in a wheelchair. And because when you go through tragedies, your brain actually starts learning how to generate that kind of satisfaction level, what Dan Gilbert calls synthetic happiness. You actually produce happiness because you have to address things in new ways, and you learn new mental skills, new mental ways of dealing with things. So I got a good little quote from him. Yeah, our longings and our worries are both to some degree overblown because we have within us the capacity to manufacture the very commodity we're constantly chasing. When we choose experiences, which is his way of kind of saying, you actually have to invest into the pursuit of something or the approach of something. And although it's outside of his lectures, if you ever find them online, the process is now better understood. It's to do with the hope circuits in the brain, because the hope circuits in the brain are almost exactly the same as the pleasure circuits. But there seems to be a difference which we don't fully understand, which is that when I'm hoping for something, if I'm hoping, because I go out with a metal detector, that I might find the equivalent of £20 worth of coins in. Actually, the hope of finding something and doing something that might get me something is as intense. In fact, it's very often more intense than the reward of if I actually found it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So in actual fact, they can see the same areas of the brain light up, but more intensely. So I go out with I will lose interest if I never get any hint that this hope is going to go anywhere. So interestingly, with the hope circuit, I'm sorry, I should have, if I'd had, as I say, there are so many slides I could do. With the hope circuit, if I hope for something and it just is never ever going to happen, like playing the lottery, after a while the happiness turns itself off. It's kind of like, false hope, not going to work. And equally, if I hope that I'm going to have it happen and every time I go out I do get it, also the same thing kind of turns off. It's, do you want the reward, you get the reward, but every time you go out you can do it. Does that make sense? The thing that the hope circuit really likes is where there's a genuine kind of 50-50, am I going to get it or am I not? And we find that so addictive, which is actually part of the reason why we check our phones all the time, is will someone have liked my last statement, which wasn't that funny, on Facebook? Sometimes when I look they have, sometimes they haven't. See, so ironically, it's not just about rewards, as often we hear talk about rewards, it's because actually there is a hope factor, which if you've got nice friends, hopefully they do like every now and again things that you put. So sometimes they do say those things and then you're kind of, hey, they gave me one. But actually it was, you were more energized and more engaged, and this is just a fact, you will be more energized and engaged on the hope that they will have done than an actual when they do. That makes sense. So that kind of putting all those things together, the last little bit I just wanted to get was that final quote, that final line from the quote. We're constantly chasing, the commodity we're constantly chasing when we choose experience, which is that there are ways in which we can actually arrange life where effectively we're investing into something that we're kind of hoping for, we're pursuing. And actually, as he draws out in his seminar, making choices the right way is a part of that. So in one sense, the this is a blank slide. I'm going to go back to give them the picture because I'll tell you the setup. What we're going to look at in a second. There's some research that was started back in the 1950s to do with kind of consumer products and so on, and why people chose certain things and what happened when they chose them. And it started to indicate that where people made a choice and bought something, if they spent money on something, that they seem to prefer it in the future. So in other words, if I bought a bottle of wine this week, I probably will buy it not just from habit, but it seems that I actually seem to prefer it in a week's time. So that was an early thing, and a lot of it was, well, it's just you're just self-affirming, you're telling yourself you prefer this and so on. But it was a constant kind of thing that where people were kind of looking at stuff and there was a real investment involved, that they were reporting back how much more they enjoyed something than if the situation was different, where people were just given something. Or in the situation, as we discovered in more recent times, where you've got so many options you can't really compare them, so you just choose one randomly. But what they were finding is where people were actually engaged and had to think about it, and they maybe had a few options and they had to put their own money into it, and actually once you've got it, you can't just kind of take it back. There's a real cost to it and so on. That actually they're kind of the experiences that they were reporting, whatever the good was, whether it was a bottle of wine, whether it was a washing machine, was that the more they had invested into the process, the more they seemed to appreciate it, the more important it becomes to them, and the more, if you like with my dogs, it feeds into my sense of well-being. Becomes one of those things. And so the thing that he had an interesting thought was, well, I wonder what happens with amnesiacs. So people don't remember that they made a choice. So they actually created this experiment, which is what I was going to put up, and actually it kind of proves that your choice changes your affective aesthetic, is the phrase. So what they did is they went into people who don't make, they have long-term memories, but they don't make new short-term ones. It's often due to the damage or alcohol or drug use that's damaged part of the brain. So they're kind of making instant memories for the next, but give it a half an hour or a day and the memories have all gone, they're not there anymore. And so they would go in and they were just doing various things with them, and they'd get out, say, 6 Monet prints, and they'd ask the person just to rank them in terms of their order. So so number 6 is the one you like least, the number 1 is the one you like most. So the person would put the things in order, and then they'd say, oh, you know what? Actually, we've got, and it didn't matter whatever order they put them in. They'd say, actually, I've got a couple of these prints with me. Would you like one of them? You see, they'd say yes, but of course they never had the one they liked the most, nor the one they liked the least. They always had the 2 in the middle, numbers 3 and 4. So actually you can keep one if you'd like. See, so you can have one of these, and so the person would say they would choose one. It wasn't their favourite, but it was one that they liked. They'd say. So normally the person would choose the one they ranked as number 3. Occasionally they would change their mind at the last second, and go for number 4, and then the researcher would go out and come back the next day, at which point the person doesn't remember who they are, doesn't remember anything, and they would go through exactly the same process again. And this time they would say, they would ask them to rank the things and put them in order again, and what actually happened was this. Here you go. Oops, no, look at that middle one's supposed to be nicely sped out. those middle 2 weren't supposed to be on top of each other. It's just obviously my animation's not quite worked. But basically what happened is the one that they had chosen the day before will go up the rankings, and the one that they had rejected the day before would drop down the rankings. Is that making sense? So they had no memory of choosing the one that they chose yesterday, but something in them had changed in regard to it, as they refer to it as their affective aesthetic. And so they've done this so many times to kind of cut out all of the bias and so on. And at a basic level, what they found was a control group, people who remembered what they'd said the day before. That as you would expect, the one they chose has gone up, and on average, the position had gone up by just over half a position. Some people it hasn't changed at all. Others it's gone right and so on average it's gone up half a position, and the one they rejected has gone down just over half a position. With those who didn't remember, that the one they reject is about the same as the control group. So somehow that's the same. But actually, the one that they chose, and they don't even remember choosing, they prefer now by over a whole position, which is higher the control group. So the kind of summation of it was that the control group kind of remembers that they chose it the day before, and actually that memory almost is downplaying the fact that it's improved the effect. And so what they felt there, and they did this within a kind of a context of testing these things in loads of different ways. This was with amnesiacs. They did it with other students, and one of the things they discovered is that the kind of, if you like, the position changes the more that someone has invested into it, and the more fixed and concrete the choice is. So if you give people the choice, but it's always changeable, they get almost no change. They don't prefer the thing that much more than the day before. And there's always that I can always give it back. Whereas if they have to make a decision kind of quickly, and they know that actually once they make a decision that certain things that are lost to them and so on and so forth, the more it costs them, the more committed and the more it becomes wound into their psychology. So that was a very long way of kind of actually drawing out that this is something about where your treasure is, what you need to invest into is where your heart goes. Your heart is made in such a way that it seems to follow what you choose to invest into. And that's part of, if you like, the logic of this guy's kind of synthetic happiness thing, which is one of the things you learn when you go through the tragedies. You have to learn to invest to other smaller, simpler things. But in doing so, you actually do it more deliberately, and therefore you actually end up with a life that feels happier than those who just are always looking to feed it from what happens naturally. And because what happens naturally tends to produce a resistance to you in terms of effect, and it increases your hunger, which makes you more desperate for it. Whereas actually the things that you invest into seem to be kind of much more connected with the hope kind of process. I'm hoping for something when I invest into this, if you like, and it seems to be longer lasting, and it can often be more intense. That seems to be the kind of the outflow. And so there's something in that, I think, just in the way Jesus positions it, which puts this whole thing of where is it, are we investing into things that come from a spiritual vision that God has given to us, or are we looking for things that give me status at a human level? Because status at a human level, it's just the way that the psychology of the brain works is, if you think about the stuff we have today, in the ancient world, there's I found a little thing. It had a fruit which I've never seen. It's just, I can't remember what it's called now. Grows in South America. That Mark Twain said is probably the sweetest fruit in all the earth. You know, but it really doesn't grow easily outside of where it comes from. And apparently, it's incredibly kind of sweet. They say it's like peach ice cream. Is the kind of the flavour. So he said it's but that was a really rare thing. You know, most of the time we get a Cox's pippin apple and it's sort of sweet. You know, if you grow up with Cox's pippin apples, and then you have an apple pie which has got a spoon of sugar in it, that's amazing. You see, whereas we grow up in a world where you've just got sugar-loaded drinks, sugar-loaded this, sugar-loaded that. We've refined it to such a degree. See, if our brain just worked in absolute terms, you know, it would be blowing up with the kind of pleasure you get from that sugary apple pie. Instead, all it does is that you can see why it dulls itself. Is that sugar is actually is like, oh, this is now my base level. See, so now I don't think it's sweet anymore. I don't notice the salt in it anymore because I'm eating salty food. It's the same sort of things that happen with happiness when we get them naturally. Is if our life is full of things that make us naturally happy, we actually have such a kind of a high level that the way that we really notice it is relative. Is when I get a little step up or a little step down. And so this is part of the reason why so many people who grow up in privileged households become desperately miserable. Because actually they've had a very nice life given to them. It's had all of these pleasurable experiences, but actually that none of those things anymore actually count in their own right. You know, skiing in Aspen or holidaying in Barbados, that isn't a treat for a lifetime. That's just what we do every week, you know, and so it doesn't count for much. But the only thing is, if I don't go this year, I really feel it. That's desperate. See, so sorry, I know I'm sure these things are kind of in one sense obvious, but we've actually kind of studied them, I suppose, is what we're driving at now. And I think it's not totally irrelevant, as we're going to see, because Jesus is talking about what gives us anxiety, where we're getting pleasure from, what we're pursuing, what we're investing into. All of these are all part of the kind of mix. So he goes on and says, the lamp of the body is the eye. So if therefore your eye is sound, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, highlighted in green, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? So in many ways he's driving at this thing, which is if I've got so used to something or other that I can't appreciate it anymore, you're in quite a sad place. What he's drawing in here, Jesus is drawing in the concept of the evil eye. We see it in several times in Jesus' teaching. And it actually seems to have originated in Greece about 3,000 years ago, so about 1000 BC. But of course then Greece went on and conquered most of the world and it exported and transported people. And so it took the concept, the philosophical concept, you find it in the writing of Plato, you find it in the Greek dramatists and so on, is the concept of the evil eye. So we know it seems to originate in Greece, and then the Romans adopted it, and so it spread quite the way across the ancient world and into Europe. And then when Europeans went across to South America, you find it now in South American culture. And so it's become a kind of a standard sort of a model. It's absorbed, that spread all the way through the Greek Empire, then the Romans, as I said, and actually it made an impact into Jewish culture as well. And so in Jesus' day, it's actually part of the common vernacular. We find it hugely in the writings of the rabbis. So the kind of precise details of how and why envious eye has a bad effect, or has an evil effect, would vary to some degree, depending on if it's Roman, is it Greek, or is it down in this place. But fundamentally, it's always seen as being, it starts off, the evil eye comes about as a manifestation of jealousy and envy. It's about the way I look at things. I'm looking around and seeing what you've got, and I wish I had it. And so it starts that way, but normally, it usually then becomes active in spreading malevolence. So in other words, because I look with jealousy, in the way that people started to think is something about me becomes evil in the way I look. And so it would be worked up, and you can find in Greek writing the fear that there are places in the world where people can look at you with the evil eye and you'll die. Which we often kind of throw around as a trope now for how we understand primitive people, but that goes right the way back to the Greeks. That some of those kind of people who see the world with such bitterness because of what they don't have and what you do have, and they look at you with such kind of venom, and it can somehow, that spirit can affect you and cause this sickness, and it becomes the root of cursing. And so the evil eye kind of becomes a part, if you like, of the dynamic of cursing, which you then find creeps into Judaism. So I'm just kind of giving you some of the backstory to understand when Jesus uses it. I've got a little kind of comment here on this, because it's often seen as a manifestation of jealousy and envy. But of course, actually, in the Ten Commandments, God says, I Yahweh your God, am a jealous God. So I'm saying, what's the difference between jealousy and envy? And it's an interesting kind of thing, because actually you find this distinction actually in psychology, that's looked at the dynamics, if you like, the psychology of envy. So, and it makes a distinction between malicious envy and benign envy. Benign envy doesn't have to always be good, but it isn't necessarily bad. And there are certain things, and you'll sometimes see them. You'll see kind of newspaper headlines that say science has proved that envy is good for us. What they're actually talking about very often is this kind of the layer, the benign envy, which, as I'm going to say, is actually something that even God has to a degree, as we're going to understand its limits. So this is a little quote from a Dutch researcher who kind of highlighted this difference. The motivational goal of malicious envy is to hurt the position of the other and to prevent the other from being better off. So I can see I can see that you've got a nicer car than me. So actually, all I really want is I don't want you to have the car. I can put it that way. And therefore, if a misfortune befalls the person who's got the car, sorry, John, I might secretly feel a bit happy, you see. And of course, we've all kind of picked up and taken on the German word for it now, Schadenfreude, is when we kind of, and that's, if you like, at the root of what he refers to as kind of of malicious envy. And whereas on the other hand, it's possible to have a kind of, if you like, an envy, which we're going to link is perhaps what's covered more by the word jealousy, that is much more about a kind of a strong motivation towards acknowledging what's really valuable, if I can. And so jealousy is actually focused on guarding what's valuable and the things that mark out status. So I can be jealous over my ability to play football, and therefore I need to guard it well, if that can make sense. But the difference is, in one sense, the focus is on, and it isn't necessarily true that jealousy, which could be seen as the benign envy, leads to good results, but it is actually seems to be a factor very often in the things that actually draw people to stretch themselves. So it's not that jealousy is always good and envy is always bad. Jealousy could be good or bad, if I can put it that way, in the sense that if it's the strong motivation that makes me work hard for something, to acquire it and so on, it's not that you've got a car and I will feel happy when you don't have a car. It's that you've got a car that makes me think I'm going to work harder and I'm going to achieve that. Does that make sense? Or I've got this skill, I've got this relationship, and I'm going to work really hard to protect this relationship I have with my wife because I'm jealous for it. You see the sort of thing. So jealousy can kind of go either way, but envy is always malicious. I'll put it that way. And that kind of understanding, what interesting you find is the reason why this Dutch guy here researched it is because in Dutch they have different words for the two things. We sort of do. Jealousy is a bit more blended in English than apparently the Dutch and Germans do as well. And he noticed that quite a lot of languages have two different words for it. So he kind of highlighted it with various surveys and testing and so on. So this idea, though, this concept of, if you like, that thing that looks and it can start maybe with jealousy, but it then turns into envy, and it being destructive. So it creeps into Jewish thinking. So it comes up regularly in the Talmuds. So if I give you a couple of examples, it was so easy to find examples. They're not all that good, but they were just loads and loads of them when I looked online today. So I've chosen this one. This is a comment actually on Joseph. And it's a comment on Genesis 33, where Jacob is going back with his sons, and Esau sees him, and Esau comes to greet him. And the verse we read in Genesis 3:33 is 5 and then plus. It's that's Esau, lifted up his eyes and saw the women, ... and the children, it goes on, and all the other things. And then within the Talmud, there's a midrash, the Bereshit Rabbah. It's just one of the sections. It helps you if you want to go and look it up, which actually kind of expounds this and said, Joseph said, so this is a comment, it's kind of an exposition. So in this context, Joseph is supposed to have said, Joseph said, this wicked man has an evil eye, see? So here it is in a commentary on the Old Testament by rabbis of roughly Jesus's period. Let him not look at my mother, see? So he's got an evil eye, he's looking at her jealously, if you like. Obviously his mother is the wife of a brother and of the same sort of age and everything else, so you can see what he's thinking. So therefore it's written, Joseph is a fruitful bough before the eye. So it adds that. So it's expanded what's actually in the Bible. It says it's in the blessing of Joseph, which is in the end of Genesis, when Israel is blessing his sons. He uses that phrase, Joseph is a fruitful bough. ... and then he says it again, a fruitful bough, and this time they've added to it before the eye. He's fruitful even with somebody looking at them with the evil eye, with the jealous eye. Does that make sense? You made yourself big before the eye. It's the kind of comment it addresses. So something about Joseph is saying you were big enough that you were able to resist the look of the evil eye. You saw it, you knew it was there, and actually you stood up and you protected your mothers. The context that I've missed out here. And as a result of that little kind of thing, the rabbinic kind of comment, and this is just how to get, so this is to help us understand how much those in Jesus' day would know what he's talking about. So Joseph's beautiful bough comes from Genesis 49. At some point, the blessing of Joseph actually got written down and manufactured into a little amulet that Jewish people used to carry to ward off the effects of people's jealousy, you see. So taking these kind of comments from the Talmuds, which kind of recognise that something about Joseph was able to resist the effects of Esau's evil eyes. He looked at his mother jealously and looked at all of the cattle and everything else and so on, and he was able to ward it off. And so as a result, they take his blessing and they turn it into a little amulet. And that becomes so what I'm drawing out is this is part of kind of pop culture that Jesus is talking to when he addresses the evil eye. He knows what people understand by it. And actually it is about looking at the stuff that others have got and desiring it. It's coveting it. It's actually breaking the 10th commandment. Um, but the rabbinic literature, so in the rabbinic literature, so you can either take this thing from Joseph, that's a nice thing, but a more general kind of effective defense against people's jealousy. Because I'm going all over the place tonight. It's not making the best recording, I'm sure. Is that the idea was that it starts with jealousy, but in the end it becomes something that is kind of projecting out of the eyes. The certain person is ejecting, if you like, malevolence and curse and a bad spirit. And so this needs to be something you protect against. And so this has become part of the day-to-day superstition. If you go to loads of parts of the world, you find people live in constant, day-by-day habits of trying to deal with the local small superstitions. You know, the milk has gone bad, somebody has been speaking badly of me, that kind of, what do I need to do? Well, let's throw some salt over this shoulder and do this here. And it just becomes part of the routine. And while we don't like to think of it like that, but that's true of the Judaism that Jesus is born into, people have these superstitious things that are often based on scripture, as we just seen, we followed it through, but they have become, like everything else, we're kind of carrying a little magic amulet to protect me. You know, it's like wearing a St. Christopher. Is that a Catholic Christian thing, or is it a superstitious thing? But actually a more effective way, another kind of, if you like, more general thing of defending yourself against the evil eye is to keep your wealth and success secret, because then you don't draw the attention of people who are jealous and envious. Does that make sense? So in other words, and now suddenly what we're seeing is actually these things are beginning to filter together with stuff we've looked at in the Sermon on the Mount before, because Jesus has just talked about the pursuit of righteousness, and he's saying pursue it in secret, you see. When he addresses the evil eye, people understand that in one sense what Jesus is talking about there is you're kind of pursuing things in secret. And it's not that he's saying do it in secret because that way the evil eye won't get you, but there's probably a mental thing, this idea of that you're pursuing the things of God in secret. And actually, Jesus kind of in that kind of context is realizing, you know, this whole idea of are these things got blessing on them, or are they in a dangerous place? And so he introduces the kind of concept. So to kind of just to kind of give you here's another little quote from the Babylonian Talmud. So Rabbi Yitzchak said, "Blessing is only possible in things that are hidden from sight." You see, this is where it's coming from. As it's written, and this is again another quote from the Bible now, "The Lord shall command blessing upon you in your storehouses." In the school of Rabbi Ishmael, it was taught blessing is only possible in things not under the direct control of the eye. So what you're getting coming in here that people are thinking is I'm trying to live life and I'm accumulating, but it may all go wrong. The world goes wrong. The reason I want you to get this is because, of course, then Jesus is going to address that, about your anxiety, because your Father in heaven is going to look after you. But they're worried about, I lost it, so I have to hide the fact. It may be because it was too public, and somebody saw me and was jealous of me, and because they were jealous of me, they looked at me, and now that thing is cursed, and so the things I stored, the rats broke in and ate all my grain, and that must be because of the evil eye. You see the kind of the flow, which Jesus is going to kind of address. And you've got these two things. So what they're saying is, there's a rabbi who that they're quoting here in the Babylonian Talmud who's saying that you can't have blessing on things that are in public if people know about them. And what they actually then did is they then say, because the storehouse actually hides how much you've got. See? So, you know, if you've got a big storehouse, there's always a big storehouse. People don't know how much grain you've got in there. This was the logic, you see, just to kind of went there. So storehouses are good because they hide whether you've got a lot or not. And if you haven't, if nobody knows, then God can bless it. You see, that's why He can bless the storehouse. Now that's not, from my point of view, good biblical exegesis. But this is the way that people are thinking in the context. And the reason they're thinking of that is because so much in life was unfair, and they would lose things, and so they're constantly losing. They're trying to work out. But then, of course, you're looking over there, thinking, well, is it him because they looked at me in these kind of ways, and so on. So Jesus has just taught about things that are invested in secret for righteousness' sake. And so in that context, he starts bringing up the whole issue of the evil eye that might be robbing people. And then he kind of kicks in with, so no one can actually serve two masters, because either he's going to hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and mammon. And Jesus introduces a word which again causes this confusion. Because as time went on, in kind of Christian thinking, mammon became, if you like, a god or a spirit of money. So a lot of translations will put wealth or riches because it's related to that word, but it's given a capital letter because it seems to be a name. The only problem with that thinking is, I say the only problem is, it is you don't find it in Jesus' day. And also Jesus does say, he tells us in Luke that we should be faithful with unfaithful mammon. Now he wouldn't be saying being faithful if it was a demonic god, if I can put it that way. And actually a much better thing, which is you'll find sometimes is even translated this way, is the thing that someone trusts in. It seems that mammon was, if you like, the skill that you've got that allows you to make money. It's the thing that you can rely on. I know I can always fall back on this. And so actually what's at kind of stake here is this issue of where do I find my security? If I can put it that way. Is it actually that I'm giving and I'm investing secretly into the things of God, and my reward is building in heaven, but it's not always so tangible. But I don't need to be jealous of the guy next door who's got a bigger pension pot than I've got, and because that's not where my security lies. And it's not that therefore we don't use mammon, because Jesus elsewhere says be faithful with that skill. He says be faithful with unfaithful mammon, because sometimes it works for you, sometimes it doesn't. Some days you train for years and years and you become an accountant, and then somebody comes up with a new piece of AI software and you're not needed anymore. It worked for a season, but it was a bit fickle, it was a bit unfaithful, and let you down the next year, if you see what I mean. But we've got to be faithful with what we've got, like that. But we can't serve it. If that's the thing we serve, then actually it does drive us to this place where we look competitively and we become jealous of the opportunities that others are getting. And I'm saying that as someone who genuinely, I go through those things. I don't know if you do. I regularly, you get to a certain age. I think it happens when you get to a certain age, where you can't change the choices you made in the past, but you look back at it and think, come on, if I hadn't done it that way, I could have done this. I'd have been much better off. I could have been as well off as them. Why didn't I do it? And then it's very easy. What actually then happens is you start to regret, if you like, what you could have had. You end up not being able to appreciate what you do have by the choices you did make, if that makes sense. Because you can't have everything. Instead, what we've got to do is to be able to kind of appreciate what we have got, the story that I have told by the choices I've made and the things I've invested into, and and on a personal level, and it's just one of those things. My own story is, I can tell you 4 or 5 really quite key turning points where we prayed things through and we made the choice that was, if you like, the wrong financial choice, but was the right thing for following where the Lord took us. And we look back at where we are, as of myself and Judith, and we often say, well, maybe we'd have had a better house if we'd done this, but we wouldn't have had a better life. Because actually there's been a great adventure in that life, if that makes sense. And so it's not that we totally ignore those skills and we don't use them, because that goes against, but we're not primarily, who is it we serve? Because actually I can serve the Lord with my mammon, with my skill. If I'm a good musician, I can lead worship, or I could join a rock band. Maybe I could join the rock band and also be involved in worship. But you find your ways of using your skill, but to serve the Lord, if I can put it that way. And the flip side is what we're kind of, in one sense, we're driving at as we're doing this is breaking the habit that actually stops us falling into the trap of envy, because envy is a very powerful thing. So and it kind of, as I say, you could have jealousy, which is I'm jealous for the skill that has real value to it, and that's good in the protective sense and so on. But if I then make that the main thing rather than the Lord, if I start to try and serve that, then it starts to become destructive, and the jealousy then starts to become envy, because I look at those who seem to be doing better at those, and all I care about is that they're doing better or not. So again, throwing in a few more kind of research papers. National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Japan find that the brain regions involved in registering physical pain are aroused when subjects focused on things that they were envious of. So they got people to honestly kind of talk about things they were envious about, and they were looking at what was going on in their brains. And actually they found that when they were talking about the things they're envious of, the circuits that are genuinely involved in feeling pain are active. So envy is genuinely painful. And so it isn't something, this is why I put that quote right at the beginning. And so jealousy can lead to positive results. It can cause us to kind of achieve some things and step forward and to protect things that need to be protected. But if it becomes kind of just jealousy for its own sake, it can then transition, and it stops being about valuing the object, if you like, in a way that could become useful and beneficial to me. It then becomes actually resenting the person who's got it. And so what they then found is, conversely, the brain's reward circuits were activated while imaging an incident where the person would start talking to them about bad things happening to the person who had the thing they were envious of. So it sounds quite manipulative. It is, but this is what they were doing. As they start talking about, so you're envious of John's nice car. Sorry, John, I'm just, you're sitting right there. Yeah. So you're envious of John's nice car. Just imagine if John crashed it. And actually, at that point, actually the reward circuits turn on in the brain. So when I start to feel envious, not just jealous, but actually envious, which is focused on the person, that's the quality, is that it's become now related to the individual who's got something that you're valuing. Does that make sense? When I become envious, actually it's going through circuits in the brain that are actually active when I'm feeling pain, and it actually is a painful experience. The flip side is, the more it activates the pain, the more it will activate a reward when I hear or even just imagine something bad happening to the person who I've associated envy with. So both are in proportion to the intensity of the envy first felt. So you just notice, I don't know if you notice that little subtle change here. See these guys over there? One's looking enviously with a frowning face, and the other's got the big cake. Go to the next picture, no cake, he's looking a bit miserable, but the other guy's now smiling away, experiencing Schadenfreude. This is no, I didn't put the quote in. This was actually the quote here is from the guy on the next slide. Subjects who felt the greatest reacted to news of their reaction. To the news of their rival's misfortune with a comparative lively response in the dopamine-rich pleasure centres such as the ventral striatum. So that little lighting up area is the ventral striatum. Basically, what we've just seen here is that there is something addictive, there is something very addictive about envy, because endorphin, which it comes in when you're going through the pain centres, when you start to activate pain, you get a kick in of endorphin. And the phen bit in endorphin is as in morphine, is the same as morphine. Endorphin actually stands for something or other, orphine. It's the same bit as the morphine. And it's exceedingly addictive, but it is triggered when we're going through pain experiences. And that's why actually people get addicted to things like self-harming, is that what you do is people will find situations that they can control. So you can be in control of creating pain for yourself, so that you can experience the high that comes with the endorphin, which is like a morphine high. The pain of allowing yourself to get envious actually is addictive. It's not pleasant, but it is addictive. That makes sense. And then if you actually see something bad going on for the person, you then get the kind of the double whammy, the double whatever. So there is, if you like, an unfortunate, addictive, pleasurable kind of cycle, if I can put it that way, to allowing yourself to fall into envy. But it's not a nice one, if I can put it that way. It's quite a destructive cycle. And actually, whenever we see that cycle in action with things like self-harming, we know it's long-term damaging. It's not a it's good, it's good for me, it feels great. It actually is a very destructive sort of cycle. And that actually seems to be that's part of the psychology of what's going on with envy, is that moving just from, if you like, the appreciation, which can be tied into the hope circuits that make me want to guard for this and protect for it or work hard for it, has now transitioned over into something negative, and now I resent the person who's got it. It's no longer focused on the thing they've got, it's actually become the fact they've got it, therefore their status is higher. And that as I say, it feeds the endorphin kind of circuits and dopamine highs. So he then goes on to say, we have a saying in Japanese, the misfortunes of others are the taste of honey, and the ventral striatum is the processing that honey. So it's just kind of highlighting it is a trap that you fall into. Envy is incredibly addictive. the politics of envy, we often hear that phrase, is incredibly addictive. There are so many people who get sucked into what often feels, you see, because it starts in a positive way. Jealousy that starts by really valuing something that's really valuable in a way where it says, I need to kind of grow towards it, I need to try and acquire it. Now actually is, I'm actually acquiring it means I need to just take it from you. Does that make sense? So now it's become envy. And famously, of course, I say famously, of course, is it H.G. Wells? No, it's George Orwell, sorry. George Orwell famously made the kind of the point where he left the Socialist Party, UK Socialist Party, which is that he realised that people he was in there with, he said, we don't really love the poor, we just hate the rich. And if you like, the envy, which is very often can be the roots of that aspirational, we want to kind of look for fairness, we would love everybody to have as nice a car as John has got. I don't actually know what you drive, John. It may not be that good after all.
No, the one I'm driving now is because I crashed Alison's.
Oh, I see. So it is a quite good one. It wasn't that I saw it, and I now feel like I'm recording on here that I'm obviously jealous of your car. I'm just.
It's a lovely little Fiat 500.
There you go.
New one, isn't it?
It goes nicely.
Very nicely. Thank you very much. A lot better than when I crashed.
So everyone should have a Fiat 500. That would be fair in the world. That's the kind of the foundation of that kind of equity and whatever. And we can be I can be jealous of what you've got, but in a way that's not destructive. If I'd gone back to those other slides, I didn't put everything in. I should have done really. It actually showed that in that benign jealousy or benign envy, actually it actually feels, if you lost something, it would feel sorry for you. It would feel your loss. And people who go through that, so they're kind of looking at it, going, "Oh, I really wish I had that," but they don't feel, "Ha." See, it seems to be a different circuit. So you can have that, and that can be good, but it's not difficult for that to transition. And that very often is at the heart of this sort of, if you like, the resentment politics and envy politics, which is in the end always about taking what others have got and blaming them for their privileges and so on, which I don't want to sound like I'm being too kind of, sounds like being alt-right or whatever, but I'm just saying is that's the problem is it's not a happy place. And that's the sad thing. You can argue it's a fair place, but it's not a happy place. And actually kind of encouraging people to go there is not a happy thing to do, if I can put it that way. It's not the way to go. And countless psychologists will actually tell you this. That actually the way you actually need to kind of almost put these things behind you and move on, not kind of compare yourself. So this guy then wrote that paper I just put up from Japan. This guy here is from UCLA, Matthew Lieberman. He wrote a kind of commentary on their research, and he comments on the neural correlation between envy and Schadenfreude, i.e. the fact that there is a very strong correlation, is that where I see the pain in the pain circuits because of my envy, creates the same kind of response of reward when things go wrong for the person. So he actually, which I thought was very interesting to see, he says that, in this way, this is the way that other needs processing systems like hunger and thirst work. So this is envy and Schadenfreude. The hungrier and thirstier you feel, the more pleasurable it is when you finally eat or drink. So in other words, the more of the pain that you feel of envy, the more pleasure you will get out of the reward process. The problem is that the whole cycle eventually becomes sort of, you get nulled to it and you need to do it more and more. And so the cycle kind of grows and grows and grows. And you get into a thing where you can never be happy in life because you've never got what others have. So Jesus then goes on and says, so therefore I tell you, don't be anxious for your life, what you'll eat, what you'll drink, nor yet for your body, what you'll wear, because isn't life more than food and the body more than clothing? And so in one sense what Jesus is doing is kind of meeting folks in that place, which is there are things it's okay to kind of want, and actually we should be protective of and we should guard for them, and the Lord is jealous for us, and I should be jealous for my marriage and the quality of my relationship with my kids. There are things I should, and it can be aspiring if I see something and I go, do you know what, I really want that, and I let that motivate me to do better. But it's also, if I then start to fall into fear, if I start to fall into anxiety, that's where it starts to tip from, if you like, the benign and maybe even positive effects of jealousy in the right way, and it becomes envy in its destructive format. it often teeters and totters on this kind of the knife edge of fear, because anxiety is just a minor form of fear. It's like fear's little brother. So don't be anxious. So we need assurance in life not to be anxious. For those things that we thought would make life perfect for me, they probably wouldn't if you got them. That's the reality of the research of Dan Gilbert's. So if you do get them, after 3 months you'll have forgotten about it, max. If it, even if you won the lottery, 3 months it won't be making that big a difference to you. Definitely not in a year's time. So don't think to yourself just because you got it that you'll suddenly be the happiest person for the rest of your life. It doesn't work that way. Those things come from something else, and strangely probably they come from the sort of things that actually, as we learn the habits of going to the Lord to actually deal with our anxieties and deal with our fears, we actually find that security of relationship that kind of kicks in, which becomes that foundation of well-being, which is where we started. That the meek will find peace. And they find the good life. Goes on, see the birds of the sky. I call this a male example because it's all about reaping and sowing and gathering. The birds of the sky, they don't sow, neither do they reap, nor do they gather into barns, but your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you much more value than they are? And so Jesus is affirming that place of actually, if you believe in a God who loves you, then look to him. I regularly, it's one of those things you hear thrown away as a kind of Christian soundbite, but it is true that there are 365 injunctions to fear not in the Bible, which does match the number of days in the year, probably because we do need to kind of hear it every day. And I think that's part of, if you like, the context, as Jesus is saying. So don't be anxious. This is another fear not for you. Don't be anxious, because you're far more valuable than the birds of the air. And actually, what do birds do? Well, one level we can say, well, they do work hard, but we see them, they don't kind of compete, for they don't need the big stuff. They gather their food, they make their homes, they have their families, and they're happy and satisfied with those simple things. And you're much more valuable than those. You have your place in God's plans. And then which of you, even by being anxious, can add 1 moment to his lifespan? I've highlighted the word anxious because anxiety again is another kind of a key kind of area of emotion, which is, of course, currently is a huge big thing. We now refer to it really using the term stress. So in 1936, the hormone cortisol was identified as the stress driver in humans. And we discovered that the reality is, to have a satisfied life, you have to have a certain level of stress. The problem is having continuous stress that never disappears. So stress is something that you actually need in life, but you need it to kind of come in waves. And you need to accomplish something. Stress is actually there for a reason. It gets you out of bed, gets you to achieve things, and then you feel good about what you've achieved. And you have a nice rest during the evening, and it's all gone. But the trouble is, what happens is your phones are buzzing, and you go to bed still thinking about the things that you didn't achieve during the day, and the stress carries day by day. And when that happens, it actually becomes very bad for you. So in fact, the total opposite is that by being anxious, we actually are reducing the length of life we will lead. And you could say that 100%. It probably isn't easy as exact as how many seconds of life, but the reality is that one of the effects of cortisol is it pushes more blood to the bones, and not to the bones, to the muscles, and the more blood that you're pumping, the more you're carrying oxygen around the body system, and oxygen, of course, is a little explosive, and the way it actually makes you to move and things is by exploding. And so the more of that you have flushing through your body is why we say antioxidants are good for you. You eat things that actually absorb the negative effects of all that oxygen running around your system. But actually, if we're kind of creating higher blood pressure and things, which is part of the effects you see of cortisol, because we're anxious, we are having far more of those little explosions, which are the things that are aging your tissues. So my tissues are gradually aging because they've been exploded one too many times, think of it that way. So it may not be a huge thing. It's not kind of like, what they used to say, isn't it? Every cigarette takes 5 minutes off your life or whatever. But the reality is, if you keep your blood pressure lower, it's better for your body and you'll live longer. So it's actually the other way around. You can't add to it by being anxious. Why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't toil, neither do they spin. So working there is associated with spinning, which is now a female example, which I just think is nice to kind of notice. So Jesus is actually saying life can be stressful whether you're male or female. It may work out differently in your kind of cultural environment as to the things that expect you to do, but you can both go through these experiences, so benefits to both. Can I tell you that even Solomon in all his glory wasn't dressed like one of these? But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today exists and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, won't he much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? And so again, what we're seeing is going back to the beginning, is I'm going to sow for something heavenly. I sow for something heavenly. I'm going to kind of make that connection that speaks to me, so I'm not going to fear. Let those anxieties drain off me. As the anxieties drain off me, I'm less likely to take those things that I value in a kind of jealous way and actually turning that into something that's envy and covetousness. Well, through covetousness becomes envy, which becomes cyclic and gets me trapped in this place that becomes painful and ruins life. So don't be anxious saying, what will we eat, what will we drink, or what will we be clothed? Because the Gentiles, i.e. those that don't know God, you know, we're all Gentiles here, but we know Jesus. But what he's driving at is it's the Roman world, the Greek world, the pagan world. I forgot to mention, of course, you know, that when I put the evil eye up, I was just thinking that when I said the Roman world, I had a green eye. And that was because in the ancient world, the Greeks first looked at, you know, they looked at the patterns and they look at one of the things they said was, oh, well, you know, probably people with bluer eyes, because at the edge of Greece you get people with blue eyes. Those people on the edge of Greece had blue eyes, so the people with bluer eyes, they've got the evil eye. It moved to Rome and they were all blue-eyed, you know, famously. But they had the Irish who had green eyes and on the edge of the empire. And so for them, the evil eye got associated with the green eye, which is why we get the phrase the green-eyed monster for jealousy, you know. But just thought it's one of those interesting little kind of cultural things. So for the Greeks who were all brown-eyed, and it starts off with just how do you look at the world, was particularly those blue-eyed Greeks on the edge of Greece, you know, they're the ones who really give you the mean eye. And then there's that spread to Rome, but they're all blue-eyed, so we can't say it's the blue-eyed people, it must be the green-eyed guys. They're the ones, sorry. So the Gentiles get stuck in these things. And they really do. If you don't have God, if you don't have the Lord, then in the end all that life has is the kind of the pleasures, the dopamine hits. That whether it's nice food, nice stuff, feeling like I'm doing better than you, all of those kinds of things, that's the only thing in life that I've got that can in any sense satisfy. The trouble is it's very addictive. It just kind of traps me in a cycle. Your Heavenly Father knows you need all of these things, and I like the fact that's there, because it shows that Jesus is not saying therefore the aesthetic life is the only way. He's saying it's not that it's invalid, it's just it's not really that great. If that makes sense. That actually to be happy you do need a certain level of pleasure, just it's not as much as we think, if that makes sense. You know, if you're in a lot of pain, it's sometimes harder to be happy. If you're not in pain, you don't have to have loads of extra things. Just there's a basic kind of layer. And the Lord knows what you need. He knows the things you need to be able to sit in that place of satisfaction, to know His care over us. So seek first God's kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. See, which, as I say, it's really important. It's there, because again, if you look at kind of other kind of aesthetic teachers like Buddha, he says, well, don't have any of them. Therefore, you know, it's kind of he diagnoses the problem, but then the solution is not really a solution. It's just avoid it. Does that make sense? Jesus knows that actually the life that we've been made for is supposed to have every man sits under his own vine and under his own fig tree. It's supposed to be able to enjoy the good things and enjoy the interrelationships of a happy family and that well-being life. And that's why, as I say, saw right at the beginning in the Old Testament, inheriting the land goes with living in that shalom, in that peacefulness, that satisfaction of life. And the meek get there, those who don't try and do it in their own strength, who find an attitude of heart which is an antidote to the covetousness which we're not supposed to do according to the law, which then turns into envy. And that was the last slide. There you go. So hopefully that made some semblance of kind of sense as we kind of flowed through. The funny thing is, when we started this one, I thought to myself, "Oh, this is one of the ones I really want to do." Sorry. And today I sat down and I just thought, I've got so many things we could put in here. I'm sitting here conscious of the things we didn't say, and I'm trying to think to myself, I wonder if that actually made I wonder if that actually made sense. To me it did, but that's because I kind of, there's probably a lot of things that over the years you've thought about these verses, and I've tried to kind of dump them all on you all in one go, but I don't know if anyone wants to ask anything or comment in.
At one point you were talking about